licensed by the board, or any other event location approved by the board. If the applicant is not licensed in the state of Kansas, the board may grant the permit if the applicant is licensed to practice in another state or jurisdiction and that license has not been revoked, suspended, or conditioned. Temporary location and temporary guest artist permits expire not later than 14 days after their issuance by the board, and the bill would take effect from and after publication in the statute book. This House bill passed the House on February 20th of 2025 on a vote of 121 to 2. And I would be happy to stand for questions.
Thank you. Questions, Senator Kim.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is cosmetic mean airbrush? Is the term?
Could you?
So, just in full transparency, we build out robotic solutions for clients, and one of those solutions is a airbrush, where a robotic arm would put a tattoo on a human.
I would probably defer to maybe someone who has more specific knowledge about this particular act regarding the tattooing.
Okay, we'll ask the...
maybe a conferee might know.
A conferee may know here shortly.
All right.
Are there any other questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. Our first proponent is Representative Pat Proctor. Welcome to the committee, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Representative Pat Proctor. I serve the people of Leavenworth and Fort Leavenworth in the House. And fair disclosure, I do not have a tattoo, so I can head off that question. A couple years ago, one of my constituents came to me who has a tattoo shop in Leavenworth. And she was concerned because she wanted to do conventions in Kansas, but there was no mechanism for tattoo artists to come from out of state to participate in conventions here in Kansas. And she wanted me to work on legislation to allow for conventions, which would be an off-site location where tattooing would occur, and bringing guest artists from out of state to tattoo. As I dug into this, again, not having a tattoo, I didn't know a lot about body art. There are folks that are kind of world-renowned body artists, and they're in high demand, and they go from convention to convention, and people travel from all over the country to get tattoos from these folks while they're at conventions. And again, I don't know anything about body art, but I know conventions are restaurant business and hotel business for Leavenworth and for other communities in the state, so I went to work on the bill. We passed a bill, House Bill 2125, that was intended to get at that, being able to do conventions. But as the Board of Cosmetology waded through developing the regulations, the original intent got lost. And so this year, I worked with the Board of Cosmetology, worked with the tattoo artist in my town and with several other tattoo artists to try to distill the original legislation to exactly what it is that we wanted. So what this bill does is clarify the original legislative intent by making it clear that there are different permits. There's a permit for a guest artist, and then there's a permit for a temporary location, a convention location where body art would occur. The Board of Cosmetology is allowed to set the regulations for what would be required for both of those, but the problem the first time was that the language did not make clear that those are two separate permits, and so they were requiring the guest artists to also license the location. So every single guest artist from out of state would have to license a location that they had never seen before. And so this gets at the original legislative intent. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you. Could you answer Senator Klem's?
I honestly don't even know if automated body art is legal in the state of Kansas. I can research that, and I know where you live, Senator, so I can get you the answer.
Let me add a little color real quick. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm more concerned with if you can apply a airbrush tattoo, whether it's a human or a robot, it shouldn't matter, but I'm more interested in the airbrush side of that, if I'm interested at all.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. This only deals with kind of the current the current understanding and statute of a body artist applying a permanent tattoo or what's called a cosmetic tattoo, which is a tattoo that, it's still invasive in that it pierces the skin, but the ink lasts for a temporary period of time.
Thank you. Okay, Kyle?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. KSA 65-1940 is the definition section for this act, and both the definitions for tattooing and cosmetic tattooing require the use of a needle into or under the portion of the skin.
So that answers that question. Okay. One question that I have before we turn it to the further is duration. Time, what is your duration of your permit?
Of the temporary location, I believe in the bill, I just want to make sure I'm being accurate before I say anything. Yeah, it will be left up to the Board of Cosmetology, like how long a temporary permit could last. But in discussions with them, unless I'm incorrect, I thought we talked about 14 days, but I don't know if that made the bill.
Mr. Chair, yes, the bill does provide that the temporary location permit or the guest artist permit shall expire not later than 14 days.
But they'll have the freedom if they want to restrict it. Their concern was, somebody goes to a convention and they've got a 14-day permit, so they just wander around the state doing tattoo wherever. So they wanted to make sure that they had the freedom to restrict that.
Thank you. Senator Dietrich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here. So I guess my question was, I don't see anything from the Board of Cosmetology. Are they neutral?
In the House, they testified as a proponent on the bill. I failed to get them here in time for this hearing, but they did testify in the House Commerce Committee as a proponent on the bill.
So if we went and looked up this bill in the House, in the documents for your committee, or this committee, it'll be there?
I believe so.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
We had a member of the board came and testified in support.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Yes, Senator Reichman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Proctor, for your testimony. I remember, not personally, but a lot of the Navy guys, when they'd get drunk, they get their tattoos, and on the weekends or whatever. And so these conventions, are they similar to that, or what? How does this work? Thank you.
Senator, as an Army veteran, we're much more responsible than that. So now, this is these events are really big, and they do conventions in Wichita now, but they can't bring in out-of-state artists because of this challenge with the legislation. They're big events. It's not somebody just setting up a stand at the county fair and tattooing people. The site has to be inspected by the Board of Cosmetology. All of the guest artists from out of state would have to produce documents that they're licensed in their own state, so it's not kind of a pop-up thing.
Thank you. I'm not a Navy man either.
Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
There were no opponents or neutrals, unless there is someone in the audience. Seeing none, we will close the hearing then on 2338 and open the hearing on House Bill 2340. And with that, we could have a staff overview.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. House Bill number 2340, as amended by the House Committee of the Whole, relates to responsibility for remediation costs associated with commercial pesticides and would provide an exception from remediation costs or other liability for owners of certain property in Johnson County. Current law provides that the Secretary of Health and Environment has the authority to determine whether cleanup of a site is necessary to protect public health or the environment, to issue cleanup orders to persons responsible for an environmental hazard, and recover monies from such person for costs associated with the cleanup. Section 1 of House Bill 2340 would amend KSA 65-3453 to add a subsection D that would prohibit any state agency from issuing cleanup orders, seeking recovery of money, promulgating regulations, failing to timely grant approvals for any permit under a state program, or otherwise requiring any person owning or possessing any interest in what is described as property previously owned by the United States Army that is located in Johnson County, to be subject to or responsible for any non-residential property restrictions on use of such land, or the costs of investigation, removal, or remediation of soil, groundwater, or surface water, where legally registered pesticidal commercial chemical products were applied at or near structures on land to control pests by the United States Army at such property prior to 2005. This exception would apply retroactively. Further, the provisions of subsection D would apply only to any such person if the property owned is non-residential. If the person converts the property to residential property, the exception would be removed and they would be responsible. The bill would also amend KSA 65-3544 pertaining to responsibility of costs associated with remediation of hazardous substances to conform with the exception that was previously described in Section 1. The bill would take effect from and after publication in the statute book, and the bill passed the House on February 20th of 2025 on a vote of 94 to 29. I would be happy to stand for questions.
Are there any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. Our first proponent, Mr. John Peterson of Sunflower Redevelopment, LLC. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. As indicated, John Peterson, having the pleasure to appear today in support of House Bill 2340, and we very much appreciate this opportunity to speak to this legislation. I want to try it this is 20 years of experience having SRL, Sunflower Redevelopment, we're known around the state as SRL, having entered into a transaction with the United States Army to become the owners of this former Army facility and take on the burden and obligation of bringing that plant back to an economically viable state. And we feel like we've made a lot of progress over the years. But there are challenges. And this one, and so it's very hard to distill 20 years into 5 or 6 minutes, but I'm going to do my best. I'm going to try to basically at the outset state what the issue is. And I can do that first by stating what it's not. This doesn't deal with any contamination, any chemicals, any of the byproducts of the Army production of creating munitions over a 50-year period that have been remediated by us and by the United States Army. This has to deal with chemicals that were used prior to 1985, now 37 years ago, chemicals that were used to control pesticides. The very exact type of chemicals that were used to control pesticides prior to 1985 at tens of thousands of commercial buildings and single-family residents throughout the state of Kansas. So that's what this bill is about. I will say that as we stand before you, we have a KDHE requirement. I'm going to call it here and now a preference, KDHE preference, that despite the fact that these have been applied all over the state, when it comes to Sunflower and a couple of other formerly owned or owned federal facilities, it is their preference that it be cleaned up. Why preference as opposed to the more formalistic term of requirement? Because there is no law on the books of the state of Kansas, thus no regulation promulgated based on that statute, that requires pesticides that were legal, that were applied in their ordinary manner to be remediated. Maybe the reason we don't see KDHE taking steps for homes in Johnson County or Sedgwick County to clean up the same type of pesticides, not in a industrial commercial development like ours, but even in a single family neighborhood. Not only is there no law on the books in the state of Kansas, there is a law. And it's the law that controls, it's the regulatory framework by which Sunflower is being cleaned up. It sets forth the Army responsibilities, SRL's responsibilities, and the authority of KDHE, and that's a federal law. It is the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, better known as RCRA. That's important to know. That is the law that applies here. And it's important to know because not only is KDHE taking a position without state law, they're taking a position in direct contravention of RCRA because RCRA explicitly exempts pesticides of the type we're talking about today that were used in their ordinary manner. It exempts them from regulation. It affirmatively finds that it is not a hazardous waste. So 20 years ago we started, just to put a little bit more factual context, and the basic rules, we sat at a table, my partners and I, 20 years ago, and at the table were the United States Army, the EPA, KDHE, Johnson County, the state of Kansas. What is everybody's responsibilities as we move on? And by the way, a very unique approach. We were the first time in the history of the state, history of the United States, that a federal facility still contaminated was transferred to private ownership to work hand in glove with the Army to come to a point that the property could be used again. And as we started there, here were the basic division of responsibilities. Anything in the soil that was a byproduct of the production facilities or anything that may have found itself into the groundwater of the facility, that is the responsibility of the United States Army, even after our transaction, from a financial standpoint and an ultimate long-term responsibility standpoint. SRL's responsibility were buildings. Buildings, demolishing buildings. We did have two remediation requirements within the demolition process of those buildings: asbestos, lead-based paint. There's specific statutes in the state of Kansas on that. We've accepted those responsibilities, and every building that we tear down, we meet the law in regard to those contaminants. And then, of course, other than and by the way, again, factual context, this is 9,000 acres. This is 6 miles north to south, 4.5 miles east to west. And when we say buildings, there were 772 of them. Many of them not much bigger than this room, but there were 772 of them that we had to pay attention to. And it was many of those buildings that were wood that the sergeant got up once a month or once every 6 weeks, told the corporal, go out and spray for termites. And that's the extent of the part of the process that these pesticides we're talking about today were involved with. So as we move forward from day one with the Army, we understood that what our responsibilities were their responsibilities. Early on in that 20 years, KDHE did in fact say, well, you know, there's RCRA, but we think our preference is that those pesticides in the soil be remediated as well. That would be the Army's responsibility in the soil. Army said no. It's exempt under RCRA. There is no authority. So the Army says no. So then over the 20 years, they've turned to SRL and said, well, then you have to do it. And again, I won't repeat myself. They say you have to do it even though it's exempted under RCRA and we have no specific state law that addresses the situation. So, so that's the application. And then, of course, it goes to the factor of risk. That's very important here. And as we've tried to work this out with KDHE over the last 20 years, and you wonder, well, why did you wait 20 years? Because typically, the Army has to get its work done first. Then we move in behind them, start doing building demolition and all the other, I'll just call it trash, that the Army leaves behind. It's about $100 million worth of work we have to clear out the remnants of an Army facility, including asbestos and lead-based paint. And as they've gotten out of the way, they're about done with all their work. We're now really in the process of tackling those buildings. There's still 558 of those buildings to do. We have about $100 million of total work. This pesticide issue of that, we'll call it $100 million, is $20 million. To dig it up, put it in a dump truck, test it, because of the magnitude of how much dirt we would be, the preference is that we would take, put in the dump truck and take to the Shawnee landfill. But it's $20 million. People ask, they say, well, what's the risk? We've attacked that. We've hired the best expert in the country, given the analysis, and there is testimony that was presented to the committee by Dr. Kanan Patel Coleman. She's a leading expert in the country, particularly in military bases, understands this pesticide issue across the country, and there's an analysis in there where she shows that beyond any question, if it is a commercial industrial use that will be replacing the use that was there before, way above any risk tolerances, and even for residential, if the property was to be used for residential, that there are methodologies to where the risk could be taken below the acceptable ranges historically for the state of Kansas. One other thing I want to put in context when I say 100 million, 200 million, when it comes to 20 million, when it comes to sunflower, these buildings occupy about 5% of the total site. So this issue of pesticides is on 5% of the ground of the entire facility. I think it's also important to remember when you talk about sunflower, almost 50% of the entire piece of property is just the way God made it. It never had a production facility on it. In fact, we're running cattle on it. They're eating that grass, and those cows are going to slaughter. It's very defined, specific areas. One of the reasons we point to when we say, if this is such a risk issue, then why has KDHE not come back to this body over the last 20 years and said, we need specific statutory authority on this? Because, as I indicated, these pesticides were utilized throughout the state, and I think the most glaring example is right across the street from us is a former Army housing facility for workers that came to the plant during the 40s and 50s and 60s. We didn't buy that from the Army. They sold it to a third party separate from our transaction. The same pesticides were used there. That former housing is housing today. It's rented out to the public. Children play in the backyards, and it is some indication to us of at least the opinion of the level of risk if the pesticides were left in place. Now, I will say that we saw the bill go through the House committee, and there was an amendment made that draws a distinction between residential use, non-residential use. We're all about non-residential use. We have no intent to have residential uses. I mean, I think for those that have been out there, Panasonic is under construction. That's the uses we see. Half of our developable land is going to go, it's under agreement to be a 3,000 acre utility scale solar facility. We're about non-residential. There were amendments made that said, if it's non-residential, you can move forward. If it's residential, those owners, whether it would be us at some point after Panasonic decides not to use this plant anymore, or somebody we sell to that 50 years from now, they would have to come back to KDHE and work through any concerns they have at that time in terms of the pesticides being left in the soil. So we don't have an issue with the amendment. I'm going to close because there were a couple of comments made by Mr. Henning as part of his testimony at the House committee. Some of them were a little surprising to us, and I'm trying to be a little anticipatory that we might hear them again, but I think a number of those comments really support the position I'm here taking today. First of all, in response to a question, Mr. Henning, why aren't you across the street worried about Clearview City, where kids early? Why aren't you worried about where in Mission Hills and Prairie Village? houses that were treated with these are being knocked down and new houses built. Why aren't you there? And the answer was this. The reason that we're only doing this at this facility, Sunflower, and other federal facilities is our only authority to be there is because of RCRA. That's our authority to be there. And I say, you just made my case. RCRA is the only authority, and there is a specific exemption for these specific chemicals that were used to control pesticides. Second one that we heard is, well, these guys got an insurance settlement. They've already been paid to do this work. Bit out of context. We did, I think, once again, it helps to prove our point. I don't know if anybody in this room has ever tried to make an insurance claim. An insurance company goes to great lengths to say, well, is there coverage here? And our coverage was, is there anything that's going to happen that wasn't anticipated? A surprise as you move through the efforts to remediate the site. And before they wrote that insurance, they looked at our agreements, federal law, state law, to see if cleaning up pesticides or anything like that, hey, you should have anticipated it, there's no coverage. They came to the conclusion that, whoa, and they settled with us. Did we get everything we asked for? No. Again, I'm sure you've all had experience with insurance companies. But I will say for the record, it was just mentioned when we had the money. It was a pittance. We've used, and it was a pittance of the amount of the damages caused by what we think are these unfounded regulatory requirements. And secondly, just for the record, those proceeds we did receive went into a segregated account. Mr. Henning knows this. It wasn't mentioned, though, during the House testimony. A segregated account, and we use those for remediation at Sunflower only. And when we had to do the Panasonic deal, we had to use them to clean up pesticides. But we take money out there, we report to KDHE what it's for. It's all for the betterment of Sunflower. It's not money that just went into our pocket. Now we're asking to be relieved of the responsibility. And again, I remind you, the settlement was much less than the overall exposure in terms of the cost and the damages. The other one we heard in terms of our risk tolerance testing was, well, their risk tolerance testing came back and showed that there were some spots that were, I think it was 800 times what would be considered an acceptable risk. I can go more into this if there's questions about it, but the best analogy I can come up with is you have a formula, 5 minus 3 equals 2, and somebody says, well, the answer is 5. It was part of getting to 2. 5's not the answer. 5 is, because it's about where you put the pesticides in. Well, if you go right there where the pinhole was, it's going to have a reading, but the reading is then, the dirt spread, it's spread around, and that's how a scientist approaches that problem. Our scientific study was not accepted by KDHE, although we never really totally understood why. So here we are. I think it is, with all due respect to an agency that we've had been successful in working on many projects together and results. This one is just regulatory overreach, not supported by statute, and contravention of the federal law that is designed to regulate the cleanup of these types of facilities. And again, I would might suggest that passage of this bill now as amended to make the distinction between residential and non-residential kind of sets a good precedent. I've heard the precedent word too. This is bad precedent. Well, in this case where there's no state law, now we are setting the precedent. If it is going to ever be used for residential purposes, we now have a law that says you have to come to KDHE and talk to them about a pesticide that is exempt under federal law. So with that, we would ask for your positive consideration of the House bill, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Questions? Senator Owens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And John, thanks for your information. I too want to jump to the Deputy Secretary's testimony. And I just want to ask this question straight up. Based on what I'm reading in the paragraph right under number 2, it says, SRL voluntarily took responsibility for this property contingent upon several promises to the state of Kansas, including voluntarily signing the consent order, which is attachment 1, to obtain the governor's concurrence on the sale. SRL agreed in the consent order to address the pesticides. SRL received $109 million from the Army to perform such cleanup. So, did you agree to address the pesticides in the original consent order?
I'm a recovering lawyer, so I'm going to avoid giving you a true lawyer answer. But the question is really, yes, no, all right? This is, again, when you take something out of a statement out of context. The consent order was entered into by the Army, by us, everybody at the same time, at the beginning of the process when we were serving in part, not only as landowners, but contractors for doing the Army's work. After about 5 or 6 years, mutually decided by the Army that it's better for them to have their own contractors taking care of their responsibilities. We would have our own contractors taking care of our responsibilities. So in that consent order, the yes part of my answer is, yes, the word pesticides is in there because it's in there in the context of RCRA. And what that reference to pesticides means, if there is a spill as opposed to used in their ordinary manner, and like where it was stored on the campus, on the military base, and there was a spill, some kind of mishap where there were high concentrations in one area, yes, that is a RCRA requirement that you clean it up. And yes, the Army has complied with that. There have been 2. And they were cleaned up. It did not reference properly applied pesticides around the foundations. So that's my no of the yes and no answer.
Okay. Yes. Okay, let's skip down to 3rd then, because it appears, again, according to his testimony, and I want to hear from you specifically, SRL and KDHE agreed to a presumptive remedy in 2010 for addressing the pesticides in the soil. This generally requires soil to be removed down to 4 feet with a margin around the building, yada, yada, yada. Was there an agreement in 2010 to do this as well, that SRL according to this, chose, let's see, SRL agreed to this, but later decided it was too expensive? So was there an agreement to remedy the soil again in 2010?
I would characterize that as an acknowledgement that was the best that we could eke out of KDHE would be presumptive remedy. How do you fix it? And it was, I'm not sure there was any negotiation over it. They told us this is what we have to have. There's no binding agreement. We didn't agree, but that is, we acknowledge that was their presumptive remedy, which was cost prohibitive, particularly compared to the risk under a commercial use of the property or a non-residential use of the property. And it has stymied development because of the cost.
I have one more, but I'll go ahead and let other people.
Okay. Senator Wrighton. Senator Owens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I'm sorry to beat the horse, but I know once you sit down, it's hard to get proponents back up after opposition, so forth and so on. So it's my understanding that even as the property sits right now, it can be used for industrial use. The issue, at least as I understand it, is if it's going to be, it either has to be used for industrial use the way it sets, or it has the equivalent of a branded title put on it that says, hey, if this land transfers, if it's ever going to be used for residential purposes, then these issues has to be remedied. This pesticide has to be remedied. Am I understanding that correct, or am I missing something there as well?
That is correct, and you actually, thank you, and the reason I love the Q&A, I missed a point. probably the biggest shock after 20 years, and I am not exaggerating, hundreds of hours of trying to go back and forth to find a mutual remedy. We were surprised. Sorry, Leo, we were surprised. He comes like, well, if they're going to use it for non-residential purposes, we don't have a problem. You can leave it in place. That's the first time we had heard that at the House hearing. So, yes, and with the amendment of the statute, that's the way I read the statute, is if we're going to use it for non-residential purposes, then we leave the soil where it is and we move on. And I heard testimony from the department itself that they don't think that's a risk to the public, and that's fine. Only if a owner, and that's the way the statute reads, and that owner would be owner today or owner tomorrow, wanted a non-residential use, and I can go all day long and tell you that is extremely unlikely, but you have to worry about the very small probability, but it would be branded by now a law that would say, if you want to do a residential use 20 years from now, 30 years from now, you have to now adhere to KDHE standards for removing these pesticides that were used to control buildings that have been gone for 30 years. Yes.
So it's my understanding, even without this law, that's what happens. You guys now know that you can use it for industrial purposes.
Well,
So I guess my question then comes back to, it's either use it for industrial purposes or have the branded title. That's how it is now without this law. So do we?
I will tell you, we were surprised at the affirmative statement of the department, because you hear things like that, and then once you go back to implementation, with the utmost respect, that's not the way it works. There are always these new implications, new rules. Well, yeah, we said you could use it, but, and I could go on for 30 minutes about it. That is not practical in developing property like we're trying to do out there to bring things like Panasonic and other major job creators. It's not practical. So I would strongly urge, from someone that has been through this, I call it the regulatory bowl of oatmeal, trying to find the blueberry. I swear they said there was a blueberry in there, but I can't find it. And years go by, and costs go by, and lost opportunities are experienced. Let's codify it. If it's for a non-residential use, we have a state law that says it's okay. If it's for a residential use, I don't know exactly what the rules will be then, but you'll have to go to KDHE and find out, because there's no regulations you can go to. It's sort of what is said at the meeting today. So, and we're fine with that. And I think it would serve a purpose of sort of setting the parameters for both. It would prove up in law what was testified to before, and we can get on with our business of creating jobs at Sunflower. And it sets that, I'll call it branded. We've talked about tattoos before, but we'll go with branded. Branded that if that changes 50 years from now, assuming the law's still in place, that you have to go to KDHE and find out what you need to do that.
All right. Thank you very much, and thank you for your leave, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Reichman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, John Peterson, for your testimony. And I appreciate the questions and your answers. That's why I want him to go on, because his questions were better than mine. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around this whole thing. There's a lot of little areas I was going to, and I just want to focus on a small part, okay? And you might have already answered it, but for me, you got to answer it again so I can understand this. When he first question he asked, he said he received $109 million from the Army. Now, so that is like for cleaning up, and I know you mentioned asbestos and so on and so forth, so you must have used some of that for cleaning up something. And then my other part of the question is this like do you also get insurance money besides that, or is that the money that, do you get anything else to help clean up anything else? Or is this the total amount that came in? And then, what was this $109 million? Does it all went in your pocket, or what did it go? Could you answer any way you'd like to answer? I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're not going to, developer bellyaching about not making any money yet, you don't want to hear, but even after Panasonic, that's true. So we're on the precipice. Things are looking good out there. But let me, boy, this was such a unique and complicated transaction, but I'm going to do my best. Let's take the $109 million. All right. Here's what happened. I'll make this very quick, and I answer a question if I don't do a good job at it. We sat down with the Army. This was very difficult to do, and said, Army, what'd you leave out there? You know better than anybody. What is out there that has to be cleaned up? And how much of it is there, right? And they showed us, with all due respect to the United States Army, they didn't really have a clue. But at that point in time, they said, here's what's out there. Here are the quantities. By the way, we had discussions. What about pesticides? Oh, federally exempt. We're not doing it. You don't have to do it. And we came to a decision, what will that cost to clean up? And it wasn't 109, but it was a number, all right? And at that point, as I indicated, we were the contractors for the Army. Army was still responsible. So we would do their work, their RCRA work, and we would have that $109 million to just pay us back for the work we did. And then, but then there was a valuation of the property, this gets complicated, that was more than $109 million cleaned up. And that was a value, and the Army has a mortgage against the property, so when we sell land, we are still giving the Army part of that money back to pay off that mortgage, okay? Well, here's what happened after about 5 or 6 years when we kind of read the deal. We spent $109 million, and the site was 50% cleaned up. And the reason is, the Army wasn't mad at us. When they said there was a 1-pound bucket of stuff, guess what? When you got in and started digging in there, there was a 3-pound bucket of stuff. And so the Army said the better way for us to manage this budgetary-wise is we'll do our own contracting and move forward with that. And then, so that $109 million all went in the ground, okay, in terms of remediation. It didn't go in our pocket. Then, as this issue of pesticides used in their ordinary manner, not spills, not those kinds of things, but used to just control termites, came to fruition, this was a surprise to us. It was an unknown, it was not taken in as part of our due diligence, and we had insurance policies that you typically do that when you call it the surprise policy. When you've got a surprise, do you then go say, here's how much we've been damaged? And it's not just the cost of the remediation, it's lost time, it's the regulatory process, and we presented our case, and they said, we'll settle for this, and you know, when you get into that kind of litigation, you settle, and it ended up being an amount that was much less than what the true exposure is, which we took over and put in that segregated account, and it has been used for pesticides and by agreement with ks.gov, other environmental remediation efforts. So that's the distinction between the so-called 109 and the amount in the account, in the segregated account.
Thank you. Senator Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Peterson. Just looking through some of the record here, when the relationship between you and the Army changed to where they took over the subcontracting, did you enter into a new, the terminology is escaping me, you have a rehabilitation plan or something along those lines. Did you create a new plan to outline that relationship had changed?
No, there was an agreement that outlined it was called a remediation services agreement that was our services. So as an owner, we were also providing those subcontractor services, and that agreement terminated. But under its own 5-year, had a 5-year termination, it terminated, which just naturally put us back into Army responsibility under RCRA, landowner responsibility for anything not covered by RCRA, like asbestos, lead-based paint, which you have very thorough and complete statutory schemes when it comes to that, which we've been adhering to. So it was just a natural divide, not a new agreement between us and the Army.
Just thinking, but the consent order with you and KDHE did not involve the Army. As I read it, you're the Sunflower Redevelopment is the only respondent that agreed to that. The Army was not actually a party to that agreement. Is that correct?
And as at the time we were under the remediation services agreement. That's correct. And again, it's a point of disagreement. Pesticides referenced in there are pesticides that are actionable, which are the ones that I identified before that are spills or high concentration.
There's still an open RCRA permit with the Army, is that correct?
Yes.
But it's your legal opinion that the EPA could not enforce that against any party to clean up the pesticides that are in dispute at this point?
Well, I could render a legal opinion they could not, but I think the proof is in the pudding, as they say. They haven't. And they've been the administrator of the RCRA permit, and they have not taken the position. They and the Army have had conversations about it, but not once has the EPA gone back to Congress to get rid of that exemption. They have not. It's been our conversations with KDHE.
Last question, I think, is this is written so specifically. If we simply adopted into our hazardous waste laws the same exemption that exists in RCRA now, without doing all the specifics about Johnson County and residential or non-residential, if we just put that exemption into our law, would that absolve you of the problems you're having?
It seems like a concept that possibly could. I'd want to go back and look at the context.
I'm just conceptualizing here.
Yeah.
Just
One thing I learned in 40 years of practicing law, I know what I don't know, and be sure that you check out the exact implications of it before you say yes. But the spirit of it makes sense.
I would ask all the same questions of health and environment when they testify, but I just wanted to balance that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We have another interested party in this, but I've got a couple questions before you go. Our plan is to have Mr. Henning up here tomorrow, and then we'll finish his testimony tomorrow, if he can do that. Couple questions. You mentioned the 9,000 acres. Only about 5% is occupied, and only about 5% of that has this pesticide in it. Is that correct?
No, roughly.
Roughly.
It's 5% of the site has buildings sited on it. So there's not another 5. Of the buildings on it that are impacted by the subject pesticides, I'd have to double check that one to give you a percentage, but it makes sense, right? It's only the buildings that are made of wood, right? Because that's the reason the chemical was used to control pesticides. So, and it's again, I know people think that, man, this thing 6 miles north to south, 4.5 miles east to west, oh man, all that area that's contaminated. The vast majority of it, as I said, was never touched. And
a map, any type of a documentation of that area that is under question? You have that map?
yeah, we could show you a map that would show you where each building is.
Each building, and in that, has KDHE identified a pesticide in the area, in those?
The assumption is, and we've lived with that assumption, that if it was wood, if it's made of wood, it was treated. And I think we've done a little bit of testing to find out that's generally true. So.
now we're going to assume that 5% was the number of occupied area.
Area.
95% of that, then you're saying would not have a pesticide in it, would not be what we're talking about here. It's just in that 5% area.
Right.
That's what we're really talking about.
And those percentages, Mr. Chair, I would point out that if 50 years from now, somebody came back and said, I want to do, well, if they go do residential in an area that the Army never touched, we never touched, that'd be the place that, if that was ever going to happen.
Have you identified with, or have you got, in your talks with KDHE, have you identified the areas that, you have identified the areas that are contaminated?
Yes, sir.
And so would you say the areas that are not contaminated, you don't have any responsibility for under this agreement? Is that correct?
If they were not contaminated, unfortunately, the way that, yes, the answer is yes. I was going to get too detailed, right?
I don't have any other questions at this time. Committee, we have 2 minutes. Yes, Senator Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have one pretty quick question. And in full disclosure, I'm going to ask the other folks as well who are going to testify. Let's say hypothetically that you have a reason to go to the site, but you have your grandkids with you. How much concern would you have for them playing in that dirt?
None. And just as I wouldn't have a concern with friends of ours that live in Prairie Village, Kansas, that had a house built in 1954, that the same pesticides were used around the, in fact, I think my house is pre-1985. I think my house was probably treated with pesticides, and my 9 grandkids, with one coming in April, they can go out and play in the backyard anytime they want to.
Any other questions, committee? Seeing no more questions, will you be back tomorrow?
Could be.
Someone had a question tomorrow.
Could be, yes.
Okay, thank you. You'll be available tomorrow, okay? With that, I see no more business today. So we're going to continue this. We're going to recess this hearing until tomorrow, and then we'll take up other action that we've heard tomorrow. Thank you.